Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to another Hobby Hour tutorial. Today we're painting the Tyranid Psychophage from the Leviathan box set. After cleaning and assembling the model, I gave it a kind of zenithal undercoat, beginning with a gray primer all over, followed by a coat of Citadel Wraithbone Spray from the top and sides. The result is a slight gradation from gray on the underside to a light off-white on the top sections. Many painters start with black for their zenithal sprays, which can be great for certain effects, but I prefer a brighter, more subtle undercoat. I will also note that I did not glue the model to the base. There are some details on the underside that will be easier to paint later on with the base removed. Fortunately, the push-fit joints hold the model pretty well. The first stage will be applying some skeleton Horde contrast paint all over the fleshy sections of the model. I'm using a No. 2 Rosemary Co Series 99 brush. Work one section at a time and try to keep the paint from pooling. The next stage is to dry brush the model with some Bonewhite from Vallejo Game Color. I'm using an old craft brush for this, the softer the better. Grab a little paint on the brush, wipe off almost all of it on a paper towel, and then gently drag it across the surface of the model. You may notice some of the larger surfaces aren't very smooth looking. Don't worry about that for now, we'll take care of that later. Next we're going to paint all the scales with a mix of 3 parts Flesh Terror's red to 1 part Black Templar. I wanted a darker red base coat for the scales, almost brown, and a little bit of black got the color just right. Mixing paint can actually save you time. We only have to paint 1 layer on the scales, as opposed to using the red on its own and then having to paint another layer of something else to darken it. Just like the skin, take your time and work section by section and try to avoid pooling. With the red scales dry, it's time to add some color variation for the skin, and for that I'll use some Magos purple contrast paint. This color is pretty transparent and has low tinting strength, which makes it perfect for glazing and blends. I'm starting by painting some purple near the end of the arm, then wash out my brush and wipe it on a paper towel. Now with the clean, damp brush, run it over the edge of the purple. What we're doing is diluting the purple paint and dispersing the pigment over a larger surface area, and that makes more of the base coat color show through, so the paint appears to be blended. I wanted the purple color to be stronger on this model, so I applied about 3 successive coats of Magos purple on the edges of the arms. Each coat was blended at the edge just like the first one. The result is a smooth gradation to a very rich color on the edge. Now take some Hound orange and paint it into all these little cracks. Use your smallest brush with very little paint on it. Thin paints have a tendency to run all over the place if you load your brush too much. If you make a mistake, don't worry about it, we'll correct it later when we highlight the skin. Next, take some Sigvald Burgundy and paint the inside of the mouth. It's pretty tough to get a brush in there, so take your time. I'd also advise using an older brush and try some tapping kinds of brush strokes. That way you don't risk damaging a really nice brush. Next, get some Cadian Fleshtone and paint the tentacles. Thin the paint slightly, and you may end up needing 2 coats. Try to keep the paint as smooth as possible, because we'll be applying some glazes next, and a glaze will make any textures more pronounced. I took the model off its base to paint the underside, and I'm using the same blending technique that we did with the Magos purple. Paint a line of Cadian Fleshtone, rinse the brush, and then drag the clean brush over the edge of the wet paint. Repeat this a few times until you get a smooth blend. With the Cadian Fleshtone dry, let's go back to the Magos purple and paint it over the tentacles. I want them to have a blend similar to the arms and have a richer color near the end, so we'll be doing a few successive coats of the purple. Keep this first layer thin and avoid pooling, and then allow it to dry. With that Magos purple dry, add another coat starting about halfway down. Rinse the brush and blend the edge, just like we did earlier on the other sections of the model. I wanted to create a blended effect on the smoke, so I mixed a few different paints together. Contrast paint is transparent, and by adding in an opaque paint we can change the properties. I'm using a mix of equal parts Gryph-Charger Gray, Lamian Medium, and Offwhite from Vallejo Game Color. If the mix seems a little too thick, you can add a tiny drop of water. Keep the paint thin and try to avoid pooling. Apply this all over the smoke and allow it to dry. With that mix dry on the smoke, give the top sections a light dry brush with white paint. I use P3 Maro White or Vallejo Game Color White, but any brand should work fine. With the white dry brush finished, take some Gryph-Charger Gray on its own and paint the bottom half of the smoke clouds. Just like with the other areas, clean off the brush and blend the edge to create a smooth transition. With the gray dry, we're going to do one last shade on the smoke, this time with some Nuln Oil. You may want a second coat depending on how dark you'd like the smoke to be. Keep the paint from pooling too much and practice blending the edge. This kind of organic shape is really forgiving when it comes to blending. Next we're going to paint all the claws with a mix of 4 parts Black Templar Contrast paint and 1 part Incubi Darkness. Just like with the gray mix when we painted the smoke, this mix has some opaque paint in it, and it's providing an ideal base coat for the highlight layers that will follow. While the claws are drying, paint the cracks with some Vallejo Game Color Offwhite, allow it to dry, and then give them a coat of Gryph-Hound Orange. At this stage you could consider the model ready for the tabletop, but we'll keep going and apply some highlights. For the first highlight, we'll use some Thunderhawk Blue. Thin down the paint slightly, and carefully paint the edges of the claws. For some areas I use the tip of the brush, and for some areas I can get away with using the side of the brush. We're going to apply one more highlight on top of this, so make sure it's wide enough. With the first highlight dry, thin down some Fenrisian Gray and repeat the highlighting process. Make this line narrower than the first, and try to concentrate it on the corners and more prominent edges. If you're feeling confident with the brush, you can give the teeth a spot highlight of white on the corners. Now to highlight all the scales. I think this technique really defines the look of Tyranids, so I like to make the highlights a little more extreme than I normally would. Using some Evil Sunz Scarlet, paint along all the edges and ridges. This can be a pretty time-consuming process, but I feel it's important to get it right. So take your time and paint carefully. With the red highlights applied, it's time to do it all over again but with orange. Just like highlighting the claws, this last highlight will be finer and a little more selective. Make sure the orange line is thinner than the red line and sits comfortably inside. Next we'll highlight the tentacles using a mix of Pink Horror and Vallejo Bonewhite. Since I want to create a gradation effect, I'll mix in more Bonewhite for the highlights closer to the mouth, and I'll use more Pink Horror in the mix when highlighting the ends. Finally, I mixed in some Offwhite for final highlights in a few areas. Using some Pink Horror, highlight the edges of the gums. I didn't end up doing very much of this, but pretty much just the areas closest to the edge. Paint all the teeth and spikes with Bonewhite, and highlight the tips with pure white. Using some Dorn yellow, carefully highlight the ridges in the orange areas. And also use the Dorn yellow to paint in the eyes, followed by a black dot. Next we're going to thin down some Bonewhite into a glaze-like consistency. Apply this to the skin wherever the dry brushing looks rough. It will mostly be the larger, flat surfaces. Thin down a little bit of Pink Horror and add a few highlights near the ends of the arms. Then mix in a little Offwhite for further highlights. With the skin smooth and even, it's time to apply some highlights with Offwhite. We're going to highlight in 3 different ways here. The first is a hard edge highlight, or basically lines with no blending. Now take a look at the shoulder here. I painted a curved line highlight along the top and let it dry. I can come back with some Offwhite, thin slightly, and blend the edge. This is useful on rounded areas and can give them a more organic appearance. Now on the elbow here, I'm doing both steps in one. I'm applying the edge highlight and then blending it out before it dries. So now I'm working my way around the model using these 3 methods of highlighting depending on how hard or soft I want the edges to be. Smoother blends on rounded areas, and sharper lines to emphasize crisp edges and fine details. Some folks ask me about how I did the base on the last Tyranid, so I start off with some cork tile. I like to take a hobby knife and cut it horizontally so I have an uneven surface. I apply some superglue and stick the cork pieces on, then I sprinkle a little bit of gravel on to any other exposed glue. When that's dry, I generously coat the base in wood glue, sprinkle on a few more patches of gravel, and then dip into fine sand. After the glue dries, I base coat the sand with a thinned dark brown. This is craft paint that I mixed into a color match for Rhinox hide, followed by a heavy dry brush of Mournfang brown, Balor brown, and then Bonewhite. The rocks were given a coat of Dawnstone, a wash of Agrax Earthshade, dry brush of Dawnstone, and finally a dry brush of Dawnstone mixed with Bonewhite. And most importantly, make sure to paint the severed Space Marine arm to look like your friend's army. I painted the rim of the base with Mournfang brown, and when that was dry, I added some small patches of static grass with superglue. And here we have the finished Psychophage model. Which model from the Leviathan set would you like to see next? If you liked the video, please click the like button below. And don't forget to subscribe. I have lots of new content in the works, with a new video each Wednesday. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy painting.